Good evening, everyone. It is presently 11:35 p.m. on Thursday, April 9th, 2020. Tonight we shall be continuing with Unintended Consequences by John Ross, Part 2, Growth. And we shall be picking up from the end of Chapter 21, where we left off some months ago. Chapter 22 is entitled A History Lesson. Now, before we get on with that, I just want to say, I'm pleased to report that my final class of semester was today, so praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, as it were, because we've got a lot of time to kill. What with this whole virus situation and all the rest, that is. I anticipate that we will be able to put out a considerably larger number of chapters for this text and others in the coming months. So keep an eye out for that. In either case, let's begin. Beginning here on page 59, Chapter 22. A History Lesson. April 18th, 1943. The people in the crowded room stared silently at Erwin Mann. Their expressions showed admiration, respect, and horror. Lying on the blanket in front of them were the weapons, ammunition, money, and other assets he had acquired the day before. It was Stearman who finally spoke. "You have done what others would not, young man. I'm proud of you. Proud and thankful. He's murdered in cold blood. He's no better than the Nazis themselves. Pugh! Look at him! He has their blood on his hands and clothing, even as he stands here before us," said a man of about 40 at the side of the room. Stearman fixed the speaker with a penetrating stare. "You have forgotten your Talmud, good sir. He who comes to kill you, arise and kill him. Sanhedrin 72a, Barachos 58a and 62b. Makos 85b, and Midrash Tanchumah, Pinchas 3. Those are quotes from the Hebrew Torah. His gaze softened slightly. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16 of the Christian Bible is worth remembering as well. "Thou shalt not stand idly by the blood of your brother." I am afraid we have all stood idly by for far too long. He turned to Erwin Mann. "Perhaps it would be best if you were to advise us on the proper use of these tools." Stearman nodded to Erwin, transferring his authority to the younger man. "Very well. We have 3 rifles, 3 pistols, and a small machine gun," he started. "The 3 rifles all use the same ammunition, and we have 31 of those cartridges. 2 of the pistols and the machine gun all use another kind of ammunition, and we have 221 rounds of that type. The revolver here," he said, pointing to the Nagant, "uses a 3rd type of ammunition. We have 12 shots for it." The group looked on silently, waiting for him to continue. "Our armament is minuscule compared to that of the Nazis. For this reason, we must not waste a single one of these precious bullets. If we make each one count, we can continue to replenish our stocks as needed." He saw nods of agreement among several of the assembled men, and he went on. "This is the way the rifles work," he said, picking up a Mauser and manipulating the bolt. "They hold 5 cartridges in here." He pointed to the magazine well. "This lever prevents the gun from firing." Mann flipped on the safety and made a show of pulling the trigger. Nothing happened. He flicked the safety to its previous position and pulled the trigger again. The striker made a loud click as it fell. "How do you aim it precisely?" a man asked him. "If you want to shoot something that is not so close to you." Everyone knew what something was going to be. Erwin took a deep breath. He was rapidly approaching the limit of his knowledge of firearms. "You line up the notch in this piece of steel here," he said, pointing to the blade of the rear sight, "with this thin piece here," pointing to the front sight, "and then put the 2 of them both in line with the Nazi you intend to shoot dead." "Let me try it." Erwin handed him the empty rifle. The man put it up to his shoulder and squinted. "Hard to hold it steady," he said. He stepped over to the wall and pushed his left hand, which held the stock's forend, against the door frame. "That's a lot better. Is the front sight supposed to stick up over the notch in the piece at the back? Is it supposed to cover up the spot where you want the bullet to hit?" Erwin started to say he wasn't sure when another man spoke up. "Let me have a look at it, eh? Please." He took the rifle and examined the rear sight carefully, noting the numbered markings on it, how it moved up and down, and how it clicked into different settings when he manipulated it. Then he sighted along the barrel as the other man had done. The rear piece adjusts and is marked for different ranges. By moving this piece to a higher numbered position, he demonstrated by raising the rear sight to a new setting, the rifle will be aimed upwards to a slightly greater degree, and the bullet will strike a more distant target. Here, I will illustrate. He reached for a stone to scratch with in the dirt on the floor. "You are familiar with weapons?" Irwin asked in surprise. The man paused and shook his head. "No, but I have a degree in mathematics, and am well versed in the physics of moving objects. Though I have no experience with guns or bullets, I am absolutely certain they must obey every one of Newton's laws of physics." He scratched a curve of decreasing radius on the floor, and lay a small stick in line with it, touching the start of the curve. This stick is the rifle. The bullet will describe a parabola through the air, like this scratch. Up close, the path will curve so slightly as to appear to be a straight line. He held his hands on each side of the first 6 inches of the curve. The section did indeed appear to be straight at first glance. At greater distances, the curvature will be much more apparent, and errors in aiming or in range estimation will be more pronounced. He moved his left hand farther away from his right, and the curvature of the scratch was obvious. The mathematician laid a straight piece of wood above the small stick, parallel with the start of the curve. The edge of this wood represents a straight path from the eyeball to the target. That is the shooter's line of sight. Suppose we raise the rear sight like so. He lifted the back of the piece of wood, and then picked up the rifle and held it level. His fingers touched the weapon's rear sight, and he made a motion for the group to imagine that it stood up much higher. He angled the gun so that the imagined new rear sight and the sight on the muzzle were once again level with the floor. If we line up the sights with the spot we wish to hit, you see that the barrel of the gun is angled upwards slightly. The path of the bullet will rise at first as the bullet approaches the target because the gun is angled upwards. As gravity continues to exert its relentless pull, the bullet will curve back towards the ground and hit the target. He ran his fingers along the curve to illustrate his point. If the shooter has estimated the distance to the target correctly and placed the rear sight in the appropriate setting, the path of the bullet will intersect the line of sight at the target. He paused to make sure everyone was with him. There were only a few puzzled looks, so he went on with his explanation. "You see that if the rear sight is raised higher than it should be," he said as he tipped the rifle's muzzle up farther, "you will shoot over the target. If the rear sight is set too low," here he held his finger against the barrel to indicate a lower rear sight, and leveled the gun once more, "and the target is far away, the bullet will strike too low, because gravity is pulling it down as it flies towards the target." The mathematician looked at the group and saw nods of understanding and a few tentative smiles. As to exactly how the two sights should be aligned, I am not certain, but I suspect the gun should be positioned so that the top of the front sight is level with the sides of the rear sight. A short, balding man cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. "I do not know for certain either, as I know nothing of guns, but I am an optometrist. I can say with conviction that the eye and the brain are very good at detecting whether or not two identical shapes standing side by side are level or if one is slightly above the other. The eye and brain are not so good at recognizing whether or not a difference in alignment is exactly the same as a previous misalignment. It would be easiest for the person using the weapon to duplicate his results if he aligned the sights in the manner you have described." Further nods followed this explanation. Irwin Munn felt a surge of hope. The men in the group were applying themselves to the problem at hand and working together cooperatively. Confidence and sense of purpose were building. "Just how critical is distance estimation?" asked another member of the group, directing his question to the mathematician. The scholar nodded. "A good question. It becomes more critical with either increased distance or smaller target size, or both." He examined the rifle's rear sight again. From these markings, it appears that at any distance under 100 meters, the path of the bullet will be near enough to straight that no adjustment is needed. He held the rifle up, bracing it against the doorframe and aligning the front and rear sights with a distant point visible through the broken window. He raised the rear sight to the 200-meter setting while continuing to stare at the distant mark. Even at 200 meters, the change is slight, less than 10 centimeters difference. He was thinking quickly as he analyzed the unfamiliar weapon using the comforting logic of mathematics. That should not be a critical difference on a target the size of a man's chest. The most important requirement will be careful alignment of the sights, holding the rifle steady, and squeezing the trigger carefully so as not to move the gun before it fires. Whoever uses these rifles should also have excellent vision. He smiled ruefully. A steady hand, good muscle control, and calm actions may be difficult to achieve when the natural tendency is to panic. Who among us is a surgeon? Are there any? The question startled the group with its seeming incongruity. Then everyone saw the logic of it. It was no accident that Stearman was a leader. I am, two men said, very nearly in unison. They were both gaunt, like almost everyone else in the group. One appeared to be in his late 50s, the other was almost completely bald, and therefore looked older. Stearman looked at both men. If both of you are capable of delicate surgery in the face of complications, I suspect your eyes and coordination are good. You have steady hands, and are not likely to panic. He paused a moment and continued. Your knowledge of anatomy would also be a definite asset. He added, without elaborating further. There was no need. Shooting carefully at a distance should not require the energy and stamina of a young man. Will the two of you accept this task for us? The two doctors looked at each other, and nodded soberly. You brought us these weapons, Stearman said to Erwin Mann. Do you concur with my suggestion? Mann nodded his immediate agreement. We must make the best possible use of the individual talents we possess. There is a third rifle, Erwin pointed out. This man, he said, indicating the mathematician, does not strike me as someone prone to panic, and his inherent understanding of the flight path of bullets is probably far superior to that of anyone else here. I think he should be our third marksman. The mathematician was startled by the term used to describe him, and felt a surge of pride as he saw the entire assembly nod agreement to Erwin's suggestion. Is anyone here especially good at estimating distances? Each of these three men will need someone to help determine how far away the targets are. It was a new participant speaking. Everyone in the group looked around, but no one had a vocation which required an ability to accurately judge unknown distances from afar. Perhaps I have an answer. A man of about 40 was now speaking. My training is as an architect. Distances can be determined mathematically by the simple method of proportionality. If the size of an object at an unknown distance is known, then we can find it. Since most soldiers are about 1.8 meters tall, I think that with this gentleman's help, he said, indicating the mathematician, we should be able to construct a simple rangefinder out of a ruler and perhaps a piece of string or thread, to hold the ruler at a known distance from the eye. An obvious answer, said the mathematician with mild embarrassment. I don't know where my mind is. Why didn't I think of that? He did not say that he had been preoccupied with how Erwin Mann had referred to him as a marksman. Are all of you insane? What you are describing is utter suicide. We have no chance at all against the forces that will surely be massed against us if we persist in this madness. The speaker was the man who had earlier accused Erwin of being no different from the Nazis, and had been rebuked by Stearman. A few voices murmured agreement. Anyone who stopped to think about what they were planning could not avoid being overwhelmed by the enormity of the task they faced. Perhaps I can convince you otherwise. All heads turned towards the newest speaker. I am not a Jew. I am from Warsaw originally. My wife is a Jew, and I am a teacher of history, who has some knowledge of warfare and battles. He paused, framing his explanation in his mind before speaking. In every war, but particularly those wars that have been fought in the last 150 years, there have been many examples of superior attacking forces being repelled by defenders with woefully smaller manpower and weaponry. Many scholars wrongfully assume that this is the result of embellishment, because of our natural tendency to wish that the weak prevail through sheer bravery, just as David smote Goliath in the Bible and the Torah. He shook his head slowly. This is not at all the correct explanation. His audience waited for him to continue. The nature of warfare changed forever with the development of weapons which could be carried by a single soldier and yet were capable of dealing a lethal blow at a distance. He paused to let those words sink in. With the advent of such weapons, the determining factor in any single ground conflict was altered for all time. The man's nervousness vanished as he fell into the familiar role of teacher lecturing to his class. It had been 2 years since he had been a free man, but the rhythm and method came back immediately. With swords and shields, all conflicts were out in the open, and the combatants had to be close enough to touch each other for any fighting to happen at all. Sheer numbers were by far the most important factor in determining the outcome of a battle. When the bow and arrow came into common use, this was changed somewhat, but arrows fly slowly enough to be visible, and are effective only at short distances or intermediate ranges at best. A shield easily stops them, and the bow is unwieldy when the enemy is close at hand and charging with his sword and shield. Erwin Mann could see where the scholar was leading, and the hairs on his back stood up. The speaker continued his explanation. The crossbow was powerful enough to penetrate shields and armor, and could be used at greater distances. A man who concealed himself behind obstacles could make life very unpleasant for 6 strong men who were trying to kill him, if that man had a crossbow and could use it well. The advantage shifted much further in favor of the defending side as more accurate and compact weapons were invented that were usable at greater distances. We are all familiar with how an American band of farmers defeated the finest army in the world during their War of Independence against the British. I am perhaps more familiar than the rest of you with the events of that war, not only because of my former profession, but also because Casimir Pulaski and Tadeusz Kosciuszko, 2 Poles who fought with the Americans, are national heroes here. Perhaps a history lesson about that war will be helpful to our own plans. He saw that he had their attention, and launched headlong into his lecture. The old habits of teaching a group came back instantly. In 1775, with the exception of Switzerland, every single country on earth, if it was ruled at all, was ruled by kings. Kings that had the divine authority to do anything that they pleased by virtue of their birth. He paused to let that sink in before adding, men who often behaved much like Adolf Hitler. France was ruled by King Louis XVI. What we now call Germany was ruled by King Frederick II of Prussia. Russia was ruled by Tsar Peter III's widow, Catherine the Great. China was ruled by Emperor Qianlong. Japan was ruled by Emperor Tokugawa. All of Latin America was ruled by King Charles III of Spain, except for Brazil, which was ruled by King Joseph of Portugal. Scandinavia was under the power of the King Gustav III of Sweden. Africa was a vast continent of waning tribes, each with its own tribal king. That continent had small coastal pockets of organized civilization. Every one of those was ruled by the kings of European countries that had colonized it, like King George, who ruled England and all its colonies. He stopped to take a breath and saw that the group's attention was total. That included the colonies in North America. Lecturing transformed the Pole into a different man. There was unmistakable steel in his voice as he continued the history lesson, and the men in the group were transfixed by his words. He was a powerful orator and a great instructor. In 1775, King George sent his armies to America to make the colonists give up their weapons. At Lexington, British Major Pitcairn said, "Drop your weapons and disperse, rebels." The colonists said no and fired on the British soldiers. There was no sound in the crowded room, except for soft breathing, fast and light. We must never forget just who these people were. The British soldiers' uniforms of the day were bright red, and it is far too easy to think of them as amusing, costumed characters in a children's play. Perhaps you have recently noticed some ornate uniforms which by themselves might be seen as equally amusing. This brought nods of understanding from his audience. The British Army was one of the largest, strongest, best trained, and best equipped armies in the entire world. In 1775, they were the SS. They were the Gestapo. A bunch of farmers said no to that army. They said they would not be ruled by a king. They said they were going to determine their own destiny. Those farmers fought off that world-class army, and they drove it all the way back to fucking Boston. The men in that world-class army who were still alive hid in Boston and were afraid to come out because those fanners would kill them as soon as they did. He paused again and tried to make eye contact with every man in the room. And this is why a famous American poet called it the shot heard round the world. It took a long time for the sound of that shot to reach France and Germany and Italy and Asia, but reach them it did. Do you think there ever would have been a French Revolution if the Americans had not shown that it could be done? Most of the men in the room shook their heads involuntarily. In some countries, the people have not yet been able to wrest control of their destiny from tyrants. That is why America has become the adopted home of many of the world's oppressed peoples. Bravery and heroism are absolutely necessary. Make no mistake about that. We will certainly fail if we are unwilling to take the risks required. But those American farmers had an advantage in addition to their bravery. They had weapons which could be used from positions of concealment, and were skilled at using them, as hunters, and as militiamen. That is how they protected themselves from the attacking forces of the British and of the native tribes. Such is how we will do it as well. But the Nazis have many more of these same weapons, and are much more skilled at using them, blurted out one of the group. The former history teacher smiled and addressed his pupil. That does not matter to nearly the degree that you believe, my friend. As defenders, we possess a great advantage. In order for the Nazis to do us harm, they must come search us out, look for us, smash in doors and break windows, never knowing what they will find inside. They cannot do these things without regularly exposing themselves to danger. From our positions of concealment, we can kill them, take their weapons, and return to different hiding places in turn. The men in the group looked at one another, further sobered by the speaker's words. In modern ground warfare, when an attacking force intends to overpower an entrenched adversary, the attacking force must be vastly superior in number, and must be willing to pay a very high price indeed of heavy losses of its own soldiers. I am not at all convinced that the soldiers assigned to guard Warsaw shall be eager to pay such a price. The stormtroopers had no trouble before, when they broke our windows and smashed our doors to send us here like sheep for slaughter, a voice said from the back of the room. An older man standing next to Irwin spoke up in reply. The Nazis were not stupid. In fact, they were very logical and systematic. They knew that in order to accomplish what they intended, we had to pose no threat. We had to be stripped of the ability to defend ourselves. Do you not remember the law passed 5 years ago prohibiting us from having guns without government permission? The history teacher nodded. The Americans wrote that very issue into their list of fundamental citizens' rights as part of their constitution, so that such tragedy could never again occur in their country. He paused, a sudden realization coming to him. Does it not seem odd to you that the Nazi leader has avoided any effort to send his troops to invade tiny, rich Switzerland? That instead he should concentrate on a larger country far more distant and requiring a crossing of the English Channel? Another man spoke up quickly. I have been to Switzerland several times and England twice. Each and every Swiss home I have seen contains at least one machine gun. At that statement, the group erupted with protests of disbelief. No, it's true, said another over the hushed arguing. I've seen it myself. When I was in England, said a man who was speaking for the first time, a few of the wealthy had shotguns for shooting game birds. Murmurs of disapproval coursed through the assembled men. Killing animals for sport ran contrary to Jewish law. I saw no weapons such as we have here, that would be most suitable for repelling invaders. The English expect the Americans to rescue them, said a new voice. The history teacher replied to this. Is that not ironic, given that it was the English who attempted disarmament of the colonists a century and a half ago? Puzzled looks greeted his question. The teacher looked startled. Have you never heard of one of their favorite stories? Of Paul Revere? A few heads nodded. Paul Revere is an American hero because he warned the colonists that the British were on their way to seize their weapons, and the colonists said no. If the colonists had said yes and stacked their arms for confiscation as we did 5 years ago, the colonists of North America would have been executed, and every country ruled by a king in 1775 would probably still be ruled by a king to this very day. You can't be serious. We are what, 30 in number? Once again, it was the man who had pointed out the blood on Irwin's clothing. Now Irwin spoke up. I was only one, and I am still healthy. You, sir, I do not trust. I do not trust you to help us, and I do not trust you to resist betraying us. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrew the revolver with which he had killed the 4 soldiers, and handed it to one of the men he knew well. Take him to another building where he cannot hear the rest of what we have to say. Give us half an hour, then give him the gun and let him go. Irwin turned to face the protester. There is 1 cartridge left in that gun. If you return with a German military weapon, it shall be yours, and I shall apologize in full for my lack of trust in you. Now go. Several in the group began to protest, but Stearman raised a hand. He is asking only what he himself volunteered to do for all of us. The others fell silent, and Irwin's friend pushed the protester out of the room. No one there ever saw him again. After the pair had left, Irwin held his hand out to the Polish history teacher. My name is Irwin Mann. The teacher nodded. Piotr Halleck. Piotr Halleck. You have given us all much wisdom and hope. Somehow I feel that there is another shoe you have not let drop." Halleck nodded at Irwin's intuition. "With the weapons we possess, we can effectively counter Nazi attempts to search us out. But there are methods they can use which are equally effective at dealing with entrenched adversaries." "Yes?" Irwin said, waiting for Halleck to continue. "Methods which are much older than the weapons in this room. Ones that the Nazis have already been using against our people." He took a deep breath and sighed. "Starvation, for one. That will be a very real threat, more than it has been so far. Poison gas, for another. The Nazis are experts at confining large groups of us to small places and killing us in that manner. But neither starvation nor poison gas attack should worry our group of resistance fighters as much as other methods of destruction." He waited to see if any of his pupils would realize what that weapon was. Suddenly, Irwin Mann's eyes widened. "Fire," he breathed softly. Several men in the room gasped. Halleck nodded at his student and smiled without pleasure. "Exactly so. We are confined to a prison here in this section of Warsaw. Fire is our biggest enemy." "Is there nothing we can do?" asked Irwin. The Pole's smile became more genuine. "There is always a counter-strategy." Irwin Mann took a deep breath. "Then, Pyotr, let's talk about fire, shall we?" The strategy session began in earnest. New chapter here. Chapter 23. Uprising. May 14th, 1943. "Give me your hand." The boy refused. "Give me your hand and climb down, goddammit! They'll kill you if you stay up here." Sporadic gunfire cracked in the distance. The boy looked at the open sewer cover and shook his head violently. "They are flooding the sewers and filling them with gas, which they then ignite. We'll be burned alive." What the boy said was true. In 1940, the German conquerors of Poland had confined over 500,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. By April of 1943, barely a tenth of that number remained. Over 300,000 of them had been sent to death camps, and the rest had died of starvation and disease. The remaining 60,000 prisoners had realized that they were doomed and had fought back to the death, despite the fact that they had only a handful of weapons with which to operate. Since April 19th, the Warsaw Ghetto had been under attack by over 2,000 heavily armed German troops, in addition to many more Lithuanian militiamen, Polish police, and Polish firefighters. After almost 4 weeks, only a few of the inhabitants remained alive. The Germans had systematically set the ghetto afire block by block, just as Pyotr Halleck had predicted. As Irwin and his few remaining compatriots had watched each potential refuge become an inferno, they realized that escape was their only hope, and that the sewers offered the only chance of that. The Germans had seen this as well, and were pumping the underground tunnels full of water and flammable poison gas. Irwin Mann was running out of patience with the boy. "If you won't come with me, then take this," he said finally, thrusting the Luger into the boy's hand. "You have 8 shots. Use them carefully. This is the safety," he said, pointing. "Push it down before you want to The boy ran off while he was still explaining, and Irwin watched with dismay as he saw him cast the weapon aside, letting it clatter on the stones. Fucking coward. Irwin Mann retrieved the pistol and thrust it back into his own pocket. "He'll walk right into their arms and be shot," he thought with disgust. Puh! He climbed into the sewers and pulled the cover back into place. Blackness enveloped him. He had a few precious matches, but he did not intend to use them until he absolutely had to, and was sure he was not in the presence of flammable gas. Feeling around blindly, Irwin climbed down the iron steps set into the concrete and reached the bottom of the sewer. He heard the sound of a rat scurrying away from him, and he felt waves of both nausea and relief. Rats made his skin crawl. For months he had seen them feeding on the corpses of those who had succumbed to the starvation conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto. The noises they made in the darkness here, however, gave him hope. The passageway was probably not blocked with sewage, and that had been by far his greatest fear. The floor of the sewer was relatively clear, even dry in spots. "We've had so little to dispose of," he thought, with black humor as he felt his way on hands and knees down the pipe. The utter darkness gave a surrealistic feeling to the entire process, and Irwin found that if he closed his eyes, it was less disorienting than if he left them open. Breathing the dank air was unpleasant, but not as foul as he had expected. His spirits lifted slightly. "Maybe I really am going to make it," he thought, as he slowly moved along in the blackness, his hands and knees protected by rags he had tied around them. Irwin asked himself once again if he had done the right thing. They had always known they could not prevail. not ultimately, unless the Americans rescued them. After 3 weeks, the Warsaw inhabitants knew that was not going to happen in time. Their tiny armed resistance had surprised and astonished the Nazis at first, but the Germans came with more and more soldiers every day. The Jews had had less than 20 guns in all, and not a single skilled marksman among them. That surgeon did all right, though, Irwin remembered with satisfaction, killed at least 20 before the heavy machine gun fire demolished his final hiding place. Irwin himself had used his earlier technique of killing at close range in the first few days of the resistance movement. After that, the troops had come in much greater numbers and never traveled alone, so he'd had to shoot them at longer ranges from positions of concealment. The young fighter was bone-tired, but he continued to make his way down the dank passage in total darkness. After a period of time that Irwin couldn't judge, he came to a larger space. There was a bit of light filtering in from a grating above, and he realized he was at a junction of several sewer tunnels. He lay still on his stomach and held his breath, listening. Irwin believed that he wanted to angle off towards his right, but in his exhausted state, he had a sudden fear that he had become disoriented. He tried to ignore the beating of his heart, and listened for noises. The distant sounds of battle came through the grating above, but down in the sewer it was impossible to judge the direction from which they came. A pair of rats scurried out of the tunnel to Irwin's left and ran across the larger space into a tunnel on the right. That settles it, Irwin thought with relief. Rats don't run towards trouble. Irwin Mann heaved himself to his hands and knees and followed after the vermin. The tunnel Irwin was in sloped upwards, and that was why the rodents had chosen it. The rats had run when they had first heard the sound of water, and their primal instincts drove them towards higher ground. It was the creature's innate ability to survive that saved Irwin Mann's life along with their own. The water that the Germans were pumping in flowed to the lowest parts of the sewer lines. As it did, it formed a barrier between the higher end where Irwin was and the opposite end where the German soldiers were dropping their poison smoke candles. By the time the Germans had discovered that the sewers at the edge of the ghetto were still clear and took steps to change that, Irwin Mann had passed under the walled boundary and had escaped into the Polish section of Warsaw. "Keep pumping," the Nazi officer commanded when he saw water bubbling out of a sewer gate onto the street 60 meters away. "The sewers are almost full." He imagined the wretched Jews underneath his feet, unable to breathe. Suddenly he saw fingers pushing through the bars of the grating, and he stood near the opening, waiting to see if the man could raise the heavy cover. The soldier aimed his pistol at the sewer gate, ready to shoot if the man lifted it off. The drowning man slowly released his grip on the bars, and his fingers disappeared under the water. The German holstered his pistol and smiled with satisfaction. It was not as satisfying as watching the rats burn, but very good nonetheless. "Shut off the water. No air remains," the Nazi yelled to his men. He was walking back to them when the bullet struck the edge of his spinal cord just below the base of his neck. The shot did not kill him, but he was now paralyzed from the neck down. For the rest of his life, he would be fed, bathed, and clothed by others. Isaac Epstein, former math teacher, gave a sigh of contentment and laid down his rifle. He did not bother to work the Mauser's bolt, for the gun was now empty and he had no more cartridges. Neither did he attempt to leave his place of hiding. His right ankle was broken, and he had inhaled enough burning gas that he knew he did not have long to live, even if no soldiers came for him. Isaac Epstein lay back among the rubble and closed his eyes, waiting for the Germans to find him. "Marksman," he thought with pride. "That's what that young man called me." A smile of satisfaction came across his tired face. A few moments later, his heart stopped beating. The smile remained. God damn it, that thing's making me fucking cry. Okay, next chapter here. Chapter 24, Ruins. May 16th, 1943. The Nazi general surveyed the smoking ruins of what had been the Warsaw Ghetto. A bitter smile curled the corners of his mouth. He took the proffered field telephone from his aide and spoke into it. "The former Jewish quarter of Warsaw is no longer in existence," he said succinctly. "I shall have a casualty total by tomorrow morning, and you can expect my full report within 48 hours. Heil Hitler." He handed the instrument back to his aide and returned to his staff car. 2 kilometers to the east, Irwin Mann crouched in an alleyway. He had slept fitfully, always frightened of being discovered. His fears, while justified, were exaggerated. Huddled amongst refuse in the dim Warsaw morning, he was just another undernourished Pole with nowhere better to sleep. No one who saw him would have suspected he was a Jew who had escaped from the ghetto, for that was unheard of. Erwin Mann assessed his situation. His clothes were in tatters and unspeakably dirty. They would have to be replaced. He himself was filthy, and he had not eaten for almost 3 days. On the positive side of the ledger, he still had a few Polish zloits in his pocket, as well as the Luger and a full magazine of cartridges. His body, though weak, was undamaged. I have come this far, he thought with grim determination. I will not be defeated now. He stood up and stretched, working some of the stiffness out of his aching muscles. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and Erwin turned to look at the blackened sky in the distance. Some ideas were coming to him. I am going to get through this, he decided, and began planning his next move. Sometime later. We have found no survivors, Herr General, and but a handful of weapons, said the young soldier as he clicked his heels together and saluted. The general acknowledged the soldier's report and nodded. These swine have no chance against us. It is appalling that they even resisted. He did not say what was actually on his mind. A ragged band of Jews with a few guns and no military training whatsoever had managed to hold off the best efforts of the German army. This fact alone went counter to everything the general had ever known about the Jews. He briefly wondered how they had accomplished this feat and who had been leading them, then pushed the disturbing thoughts out of his mind and returned to more immediate tasks. The general's unease was well-founded, and the Warsaw Ghetto resistance would be a valuable history lesson for anyone who studied it. With less than 20 weapons, a starving band of resistors had held off the German army for 27 days and nights before finally being defeated. When the German army had conquered the entire country of Poland in 1939, it had taken them but 16 days. Chapter 25. Sniping. June 6, 1944. Max Collins fixed his eyes on the small, distant square. He turned his head slightly to the right and spat into the dust in the corner. They'll be there soon. Collins saw a slight movement in the distance. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the small monocular he carried. After a long look and a quick breath, he put it away. They're here. Now he had his job to do. The glider descent had gone seriously awry. The pilot had tried to center the fuselage between the two trees to clip both wings off and slow the craft down, but he had been too far to one side. The glider had spun to the left and overturned. Collins had come to in the grass, wet with his own vomit and another's blood. Not until he had seen the tattered wings had he remembered where he was. He hadn't been able to determine how long he'd been unconscious, but it was long enough that there seemed to be no reason for great haste. The wreckage had been extensive. The jeep had broken its moorings and caused most of the damage. Impact with the ground had done the rest. Max had found no other survivors save himself. The green padded canvas case had made it safely, though. He had found it cushioned between two still warm corpses and had gently retrieved it. It, too, was stained by blood. At least the landing went undetected, Sergeant Collins had thought, as he trudged off in the darkness towards the town with the case under his arm. He had immediately realized that the bell tower was the best choice. It surveyed most of the town, but was well away from the heart of the village. Max Collins had quickly found the proper entrance at the back of the church and settled himself in a corner of the elevated, open-sided structure. Then, as always, he had slept. There was nothing more sensible to do before sunrise. Dawn had broken, and now it was time. Max gently slid the rifle from its drop case and slowly surveyed it for damage. None was visible. The rifle was mute testimony to the Army's willingness to bend the rules to further its own interests. It was a Springfield, and it had been issued, but there ended its likeness to the standard weapon. Collins had spent hours of his time, while the others played poker, removing the barreled action from the stock, coating it with a mix of lampblack and oil, replacing it, and removing it again. From the black marks on the bare wood, he had seen the high spots where metal rested on wood. Through tedious scraping and repetition of the entire process, he had achieved near-complete contact of the action with the stock. The wood under the barrel was relieved to let the barrel vibrate when the gun was fired, in accordance to its natural frequency. The rifle, as Max was fond of saying, shot like it had eyes. His efforts towards accurization had not stopped there, however. The outside of the stock had been treated to 12 coats of marine spar varnish, ensuring that it would not warp when the humidity changed. A change of 1/1000th of an inch could move the bullet's point of impact half a foot at 100 yards, and it was not possible to sight the gun in anew every time the weather changed. The rifle's most flagrant departure from regulations was the 2.5 power Lehman Alaskan scope, anchored to a bridge mount Max had persuaded a machinist to make for him. The magnification it offered was less important than the fact that sights and targets were now in the same plane of vision, and therefore always both in focus. General Max Gavin himself had seen Max shooting this rig for group at 300 yards, as he did every few days when circumstances permitted. The general had taken time to examine the group, 5 shots in 4 1/8 inches, about average for the gun, looked at the head stamp on the fired brass, which said National Match, meaning it was authorized for use only by military marksmanship teams, and had said, "Carry on, Sergeant." After that, Max Collins had quit worrying about what officers might do if they saw his rifle. Max folded the blood-stained case and laid it on the ledge as a rest. He was risking being seen with the forend and barrel of his rifle exposed, but in the early dawn light he'd take the gamble. Through the telescope he saw the 2 sentries. Collins was using a 3-dot reticle and the smallest dot. The one lowest on the vertical crosshair covered 2 minutes of angle. 2 inches at 100 yards, in other words. With that fact, you could use the reticle to calculate range if you knew the dimensions of the object you were looking at. He centered the dot on the German's face. The man's face was more than covered by the spot. He moved the rifle slightly, so that the dot reticle was next to the man's head. He decided that the dot was twice the width of the soldier's face. 1 minute of angle to cover his head. Max Collins let out a long breath. His pale eyes narrowed as he laid the rifle and case back on the floor of the tower. Before he had enlisted, Max had been an illustrator, and like any decent artist, he knew anatomy well enough to teach it. Cheekbone to cheekbone, the widest spot of the head, on an average man was 5 3/4 inches, 575 yards. He didn't like it at all. Trying to get closer would mean risking discovery, as well as eliminating his already slim chances for escape. He picked up a small chunk of concrete and started to scratch in the dust. At 575 yards, the rifle would put 5 shots into an 8-inch circle under ideal conditions. About the size of a man's head, he thought. At 500 yards, point of impact is 31 inches low, and at 600 yards, 60 inches low. 55 inches low, then. The air is cool and misty, denser than usual. More resistance means more drop. His gut said 2% more air resistance. That translated to an additional 4% drop below line of sight. Another 2 inches. Hold 57 inches high, then. The problem of windage remained. Max looked down at the crude diagram he had scratched on the stones. It was an oval with a vertical line bisecting it. There was another line perpendicular to the vertical, about 3 feet above the oval, and below this he had scratched 57. He turned and spat more dust out of his mouth. He felt not even a whisper of wind on his cheek from where he sat in the high, open tower. 200 yards out, though, something's making that smoke from the chimney drift to the left and away. Over almost 60 yards, the wind could easily be blowing in more than one direction. He closed his eyes and sat motionless for a few moments. Too many fucking variables. Max opened his eyes and looked for more smoke. He found another chimney in operation despite the early time in the morning. It was in line with the target area, but quite a bit past it. As close as he could tell, its smoke was drifting in the same direction as the others. Well, that's something at least. He looked again at the smoke. A drift of about 10 miles per hour. No, a bit less than that. More than 5, though. Call it 7. But it was not a 7-mile-per-hour crosswind. He looked again, resisting the natural impulse to squint. Damn near 45 degrees. Another break. Crosswind component 71%. Times 70 miles per hour, and we're back at 5 miles per hour breezing drifting the bullet left. With the 172-grain military match boat tail, traveling at 2,800 feet per second at the muzzle, 10 inches drift at 500 yards, 15 inches at 600. A private had once asked him what the trick was to figuring out the various drops and wind drifts in different winds, when a ballistic table was not at hand. Ever hear of those guys who can take 2 3-digit numbers and give you the product straight off? Max had replied. Yes, sir, I believe I have, but I don't know how they do it either. Same simple trick I use. Pure rote memorization, he smiled. Like Ad Toppervine and John Browning, Max Collins was part of the gun culture. Max lifted the stone again, cushioning it against his calloused fingers. Along the horizontal scratch, about 10 inches to the right of the vertical mark, he made an X. Between this mark and the vertical line, he scratched the number 14. Now, as long as the conditions remained the same, there was just the waiting. He pulled the monocular out of his pocket one more time and put it to his eye, watching the square. Max looked down at his drawing. Not much else to do now but wait, and watch the conditions. Some minutes later, Max looked up again. "Bingo," he said silently, when a figure appeared in the monocular. No ID training needed to pick this one out, he told himself. The way the German moved and the way the others reacted to him was all the proof Max needed. How many stars would he have if he'd been born a few thousand miles farther west? No matter. They can give him a hero's funeral. Max folded the canvas case in half and laid it on the ledge. He put the rifle on top of it, pointing towards the distant square. Through the scope he could see the man standing in perfect profile, giving orders. The American centered the crosshairs on the general's head and then released the rifle. It rocked on its canvas rest and pointed 10 yards left of where he wanted to hit. He cradled the rifle once more until it pointed where he wanted, this time pressing the weapon firmly into the rest before releasing it. The crosshairs shifted only a few feet, and in a vertical direction. When the rest was trying to hold the gun in a different spot than the shooter was, the gun would never shoot where it was supposed to. He put his shoulder to the flat steel butt plate and grasped the smooth grip with his right hand. The left thumb and forefinger pressed the sides of the buttstock, urging it to the exact spot. Collins placed the officer's throat equidistant between the man's heel and the center dot of the reticle. Then he moved the dot over 2 head widths. Too far. Ease it back some. 14 inches? Collins willed his head closer to the eyepiece, straining for that last bit of definition with which to measure the 14 inches of space. He was glad that he never failed to fire a fouling shot with commercial, non-corrosive ammunition before cleaning his rifle. The first shot from a clean, dry bore never went into the same place as subsequent ones. Let's stick this one in his ear, eh? Urged on by the gradually increasing pressure of his index finger, the sear released and the rifle bucked, taking him just a little by surprise. A good let-off, he instantly realized, as the steel eyepiece at the back of the scope met his forehead and left a crescent-shaped gash on top of a half-dozen tiny white scars of the same shape. Crowded it too close again, he thought, with a small part of his brain that wasn't filled with more important issues. As the blast rang off the ceiling of the bell tower, Max Collins flushed all concerns of the last 3 hours from his mind and replaced them with an entirely new set. He had fired the only shot he was going to get. He had to get down and away immediately. And for one absurd, sickening moment, he had the irrational fear that he had found the wrong town, and the rest of the 82nd Airborne was miles away, about to storm the real St. Mary Église. He dismissed this nightmarish thought and scrambled down the ladder. The barometric pressure had been a bit higher than Max Collins had estimated, and the range 30 yards farther. The bullet struck the general several inches lower than Collins's calculations had predicted. The general had been standing in profile at attention addressing his men, and the bullet struck him on the point of his shoulder. It deflected off the underlying bone and assumed a banana shape, as engineers at generations before had designed it to do. Yawing slightly, the slug ranged upwards, exiting out the trapezius muscle, and immediately slamming sideways into the German's neck. The tumbling bullet severed the general's spine, leaving his head attached only by a few muscles in the left front of his neck, before burying itself in a doorframe 30 meters beyond. The quick commands stopped in mid-sentence with a noise that sounded like a leather bag bursting. Several enlisted men were sprayed with the dead officer's blood as he fell on his chest, struck down as if by a thunderbolt. His face bounced off the granite cobblestones with a sickening sound, breaking off both of his front teeth. The force of the impact twisted the head around so that the corpse's face stared slightly to the side. 1¼ seconds later came the distant roar of the rifle. By the time the German soldiers realized what had happened, Max Collins was at ground level, exiting the church. By the time the shocked major realized that he was now the senior officer and began issuing commands, Max was halfway to the relative safety of the woods. Once there, he knew he stood a chance of holding his own by silently removing his pursuers one at a time. I can stay alive at least for a day or two, and by that time it'll all be decided, one way or the other. As he continued his methodical, frantic escape, the sergeant's thought returned to that one fact which might comfort a gentler man in a civilian life, but which struck in his mind infuriatingly now. I may never know for sure. Hell. New chapter here. Chapter 26. Promotional Gifts. May 16th, 1945. At ease, Lieutenant. You're being sent home, and there are a few things I've been wanting to say to you before you leave the base. The colonel shuffled through some papers that were in front of him and selected a set of onion skin sheets that were stapled together. Your flight training methods have been unorthodox, to say the least. And they have been unorthodox, I'm told, since the day you started teaching here. Walter Bowman said nothing. It's never wise to answer a ranking officer's question until after he's actually asked it. Walter silently reminded himself. I gather that you have felt cheated that you ended up here nursemaiding cadets through fine training for the duration of the entire war. The colonel was staring at him with intense scrutiny. It must grate on you that you'll likely never find out whether or not you really have what it takes to be a fighter pilot when the targets are shooting back at you with live ammo. You got that one right, Bowman thought. His lips compressed at the sting of the words, but he remained silent. The colonel had accurately assessed the inner frustration he had felt for much of the past 2 years. I don't know quite how you would have done overseas. My inclination is that a man who doesn't think an inverted spin 500 feet from the ground is anything too hard to handle would probably be able to keep his wits about him in the face of tracer fire and flak, but maybe not. And not knowing is something that every soldier who never sees combat has to live with. He looked at the paper in his hand. I had my adjutant look into a few things for me, things that involved you, he said pointedly. Would you care to tell me, Lieutenant, how many cadets you have trained on this airbase? Lieutenant Bowman spoke for the first time. I don't know exactly, Colonel. I've been here 3 years. I'd say it must be over 100, sir. The colonel stared at the stapled pieces of paper. You have trained 437 airmen, Lieutenant. That is slightly more than twice as many as the next busiest flight instructor on this airbase. I suspect you have a better estimate of the number of your students who have been injured or killed on this facility? None, sir. That's right. And the number of your students who have washed out of the flight program? David Hearns and Paul Warner, Bowman said without hesitation. Correct, replied the colonel, although he had not known the 2 cadets' names and was startled that the lieutenant remembered them. And the number of aircraft your students have damaged? 3, sir. 3 aircraft that, according to my records, were each repaired and returned to service within 48 hours. Not totally demolished. Not like... He scanned the pages until he found what he was looking for. 6 of Lieutenant Harrison's 83 students managed to do. He put the sheet back on his desk and once again looked the young man in the eye. Lieutenant Bowman, after reviewing these figures, I did some more research. Or more accurately, I told my adjutant to go do some more research for me. I asked him to find out how many of the airmen who have been trained on our base have seen combat, who their instructors were, and which of them have been shot down or killed while in their airplanes. The information I asked for is incomplete, but 2 facts have clearly emerged. Lieutenant, the percentage of your students who have seen air combat is higher than that of any other instructor at Pensacola. Despite this, the percentage of your students who have been shot down is the lowest of any instructor here. He let his words sink in for a few moments before continuing. There is another thing that I think you should know. When Chief Jenkins arrived on this base as our oldest seaman, I didn't want him. He had been given the choice of prison or the Navy, and I damn well thought prison would have been much more suitable for him. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And I was wrong, I now believe, because of you, Lieutenant. Bowman raised an eyebrow reflexively, but said nothing. The colonel inhaled and chose his next words carefully. You have an ability, Lieutenant, to cause others to put forth their best possible work, to inspire them to levels of achievement neither they nor their superiors would have thought them capable. Our greatest military leaders exhibit that ability on the battlefield, and I believe you have it as a teacher. I am telling you this for 2 reasons. First, although it's none of my business, I think you should give serious thought to pursuing a teaching career as a civilian when this war ends. I frankly doubt that there will be the need for your flight instruction skills in a post-war setting, as we'll likely have more than enough trained pilots for all the aviation jobs available. I also think you would be rather bored ferrying cargo for some commercial venture. But your ability with students is not limited to future aviators, and I hope you'll continue to use your teaching gifts with others. Secondly, I'd like to make you Panascola's new chief flight instructor and director of flight training. If you're interested in staying on for a while, that is. I don't know if any of your methods can be implemented on a base-wide basis, but I'm willing to listen to your suggestions and give it a try. If you do decide to stay here, I want a written proposal as to how you would recommend flight training here be improved. The colonel saw that Bowman did not know if he was supposed to reply. Take a few days to think it over. Come by my office on Monday morning. Oh, and that reminds me. I'm authorizing a 4-day leave for you, effective immediately. It has come to my attention that there is an aircraft on this base which meets none of the Navy's stringent regulations for training aircraft. You are familiar with the plane I'm referring to? Bowman's heart sank. Whatever was coming would not be good. Yes, sir, I am. This plane, I understand, is totally unsuitable for student use, is it not? That's correct, sir. It is, in fact, so overpowered as to pose a safety risk to all but expert pilots, and it has no suitability whatsoever for air combat. No, sir, none. In that case, Lieutenant, I am placing you in charge of disposing of this aircraft in such a way that it can no longer endanger the lives of anyone on this base. Report back here Monday morning when you have completed that task. Dispose of it, sir? In exactly what manner do you want me to do that, Colonel? The man ignored the question. Chief Jenkins has been making sure that the craft is airworthy. Go talk to him. You've got 4 days, Lieutenant. That should be sufficient time to do the job. Dismissed. Holy shit. Walter Bowman left the colonel's office feeling miserable. He walked the half-mile to the maintenance hangar where his plane was usually stored. It wasn't there. Bowman caught one of the mechanics and asked him where Anvil Jenkins was. He says if you came looking for him, sir, to check Hangar 6. Thanks, Ensign. Why'd they move it to the paint shop? He wondered. He was still in a daze about the meeting with the base commander. He met Jenkins as the mechanic was coming out of Hangar 6. Where's my bird, Anvil? Colonel says you've been getting it ready for me to dispose of it. The older man's face betrayed no emotion whatsoever. Figured it needed a few things for its days here were over, sir. Come on in and you can have a look-see for yourself. He held the door for the lieutenant. As Walter stepped through the doorway, Jenkins flipped a row of switches and the inside of the hangar was lit up by a dozen floodlights. Lieutenant Bowman drew in his breath. Whatever he had imagined, he had never expected this. There stood his Stearman, but he could hardly believe it was the same airplane he had flown only a week before. The prop hub was no longer exposed. It was now covered with an aluminum spinner polished to a mirror finish. The big radial engine was also covered with a beautiful cowling to further streamline the front of the airplane and duct cooling air over the cylinders. The entire aircraft gleamed as he had never seen it before. It was also no longer yellow. The clipped-wing Stearman had been thoroughly wet-sanded and repainted entirely. It was now all white, with dark green sunburst stripes on the wings and 2 thick longitudinal stripes of the same color on each side of the fuselage. On the side of the fuselage behind the cowling was a rendition of a nude, voluptuous woman. She was contorted into an impossible position with a startled look on her face. Beneath her figure was the caption, "Every which way." Below the aft cockpit were the words, Lieutenant Commander Walter Bowman, painted in black with a gold shadow line. On the engine cowling, and in much smaller lettering, was written, "Tuned by Jenkins Engineering." Had a harder time than I expected getting an exact match on the green, the mechanic said, deadpan. He had painted the biplane in the school colors of Bowman's alma mater, Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. Bowman was speechless. Finally, he found his voice. "The cowling," he said, his voice trailing off again. "Now that took a while. Told you I was a hammerman, though. Took me a day or two to think it through, and my aluminum welding is a sight better now than it was when I cut the material for it. Those blister bumps over each knuckle on the rocker covers? Made 'em by building a fixture and a steel die I made on the mill, then rigged up a rubber diaphragm and forced grease into it under pressure. Pressure formed 'em in that soft aluminum pretty as you please. The spinner Jones made up for you. Told me he knew a girl back home with titties just the right shape and almost as big, and he said he'd copy one from memory. I got so excited when he was done, I half expected him to knock out another one so he could have a pair. Harrison did the artwork and lettering. Seems he's a mite tired of using nothing but stencils, like on everything else around here, so I give him a free hand, sir. Hope you ain't offended. Bowman just shook his head. All that work, hell. Bowman was thinking of the tremendous effort the men in the maintenance shop had gone to just to let him fly the Stearman to some Navy boneyard for dismantling. Lieutenant, every man in the shop knows about the numbers the Colonel was asking for. Hell, Colonel's aide got some of them from us. We did our own figuring and come up with the fact that you saved this shop one major shitload of work with all the planes them kids had sideways and you managed to get back on the ground with nothing bent. This here extra work weren't as much time as fixing the mess made by just one extra ground loop. The mechanic motioned Bowman over to the side of the Stearman and moved on to a different subject. Now take a look at this, Lieutenant. You got a temporary ferry tank I rigged up in the front hole. Should be good for 2 extra hours if you don't goose the throttle too often. And back here, he said, with a voice tinged with pride, is a couple things this bird has needed ever since we got her finished. Did a little horse trading to get 'em, mind you. He led the officer to the aft cockpit and pointed to the instrument panel. A new airspeed indicator had been installed, one which read all the way to 300 knots. I gave it the best calibration I could while on the ground. When Anderson follows you in the SNJ, you can double-check it. 300's a pipe dream, but let me know how fast my motor can pull this thing. Next to the airspeed indicator was an instrument that was entirely new. It was a G-meter, and it was calibrated to +12 and -8. Knowing you, you might peg this one, Lieutenant, Jenkins said, tapping its glass face. But they won't make one that goes any higher. Probably don't have any equipment strong enough to calibrate it. A ferry tank? And a G-meter? What in the hell for, Anvil? Walter Bowman's voice showed his absolute bewilderment. Jenkins finally realized what the young man had been thinking, and an exaggerated look of outrage came over his weathered face. Jesus fucking Christ, Lieutenant! You think you're gonna take this screamer to some scrapyard out on the Palmetto Flats and let a bunch of friggin' loop-eared kids cut her apart with a Mexican speed wrench? The whole maintenance shop would mutiny, but not afore they cut your heart out and took turns pissing in the hole. Sir, he finished, his voice slightly more subdued. Then, Bowman said, distracted by the older man's creative outburst. Sir, Anderson's all set to follow you up to St. Louis and play taxicab. What? Damn right, sir. This bad girl was built just for you. You're taking her home, aren't you? Chapter 27. Wabbit Season. Chapter 27. Wabbit Season. January 1st, 1951. Raymond Johnson stopped and listened to the wind in the aspen trees. He liked using snowshoes. He had discovered that he could actually make slightly better time on snowshoes after a snowfall than he could in hiking boots on dry ground. The second semester of 8th grade started in 4 days, and he intended to get in a lot of small game hunting before then. Ray saw the unmistakable tracks leading to the base of a lodgepole pine, where needles and bits of bark darkened the snow around the trunk. He grinned involuntarily as he looked up and saw the fat porcupine 30 feet up the tree, munching contentedly on the side of the trunk. Ray never shot porcupines. They weren't any good to eat, and there was no challenge to stalking them. But he loved to look at their spiky round bodies. He watched the porcupine for a few more minutes and then continued his trek up the south side of Aspen Mountain. Aspen had been a booming mining town 60 years earlier, but the demonetization of silver in 1893 caused silver prices to collapse. Pitkin County's central industry became unprofitable overnight. For 50 years, the town had been quiet. Then, in the decade after the Second World War, a new business had emerged. The 10th Mountain Division had trained in Leadville, Colorado since 1936, and many of the troops had made the 82-mile trip to Aspen on the weekends. After the war, several men from the 10th returned to Aspen, determined to make a world-class ski area. In 1947, the Aspen Skiing Corporation had cleared trails and installed 3 lifts on the north face of the mountain that had once been worked by the Ajax Mining Company. In the 4 years since, the Johnson family had watched with interest as more people each winter came great distances to ski on Aspen Mountain. Some of them liked the area enough to return in the summer, and a percentage of those, usually the older and more affluent ones, ended up moving to Aspen permanently. Ray's father, Bud, had seen his own business increase, and Bud and his brother Carl were getting to the point where they were going to have to hire more help and build new stables. There were more and more people who wanted to ride, and some of the new residents were buying horses and having them trained. The income from boarding fees had risen every year in the past 5, and the Johnson brothers knew the market was far from saturated. They were in the fortunate position of having the largest tract of land in Pitkin County, and it was only 2 miles from the center of the town of Aspen. The brothers had resisted offers to sell off any of their property, recognizing early on that they were witnessing the beginning of a fundamental change in the area. Ray continued up the snow-covered fire road on the back of the mountain, wondering if the skiers on the opposite side were having as good a time as he was. He judged that he was about 2/3 of the way to the top of the mountain, which had a vertical rise of about 3,300 feet. The boy saw a fallen pine tree that lay at the proper height, and he clumped over and sat down on it. It was a little after noon, and he was hungry from his climb. Ray shrugged off his day pack and unbuckled it. He took out a ham and cheese sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a quart thermos bottle of hot tea. He unwrapped the sandwich and eagerly bit into it. They taste so much better when you make them with toast instead of bread, he thought with satisfaction. Ray and his father both liked their sandwiches made with toast. Louise usually let the two of them fix their own sandwiches, but whenever she threw together a sandwich or fixed hamburgers for either of them, she made sure to toast the bread. As he finished the last bite of the sandwich and started to unscrew the top of the vacuum bottle, he saw movement 10 yards away in a clump of aspen trees. A rabbit stared at him from behind one of the slender trees. Ray carefully set down the tea and reached into his coat. His hand closed around the grip of the Smith & Wesson .22 caliber revolver carried in the cross-draw holster he wore in front of his left hip. It had been a Christmas present from his father, who had said Ray deserved it for getting yet another semester of straight-A grades. He had wasted no time becoming proficient with it. In the past week, Raymond had fired almost 2 full cartons of 500 rounds each through the gun. He cocked the hammer while the revolver was still under his coat to muffle the metallic click and slowly withdrew the gun from his holster. Taking careful aim at a spot just behind the rabbit's left eye, he let half the air out of his lungs and gently squeezed the trigger. He had loaded the gun with 22 short cartridges, which were less powerful than the usual .22 long rifle ammo he used on inanimate targets. The weaker round would damage less meat if his shot struck the rabbit's body instead of its brain. Raymond's precaution proved unnecessary. The revolver cracked and the bullet struck the rabbit a quarter inch from where he had intended. The animal collapsed in the snow, killed instantly. The boy holstered the gun, took a long drink of tea from the thermos as he stood up, and walked over to where the animal lay. He reached into his pocket as he clumped through the thick snow, and withdrew a small, 2-bladed pocket knife. Unfolding the smaller blade, he picked up the rabbit and slit open its belly. In less than a minute, the carcass was gutted and lying on top of an identical one in the game pouch belted around the boy's waist. His mother made a delicious rabbit stew, and he was already imagining how good it would taste after an entire day of snowshoeing. Ray put his day pack back on and continued up the fire road. The cold air felt invigorating in his lungs, and he started whistling a song his father sometimes sang when he was shoeing the horses. Foggy, foggy dew, da-da-da-da-da. 1941 was shaping up to be another good year.
When I was a bachelor, I lived all alone. I worked at the weaver's trade, and the only thing that I did that was wrong was to woo a fair young maid. I wooed her in the winter time, part of the summer too, and the only thing that I did that was wrong was to keep her from the foggy, foggy dew. One night She knelt close by my side when I was fast asleep. She threw her arms around my neck and then began to weep. She wept, she cried, she tore her hair. Mommy, what could I do? So all night long I held her in my arms just to keep her from the foggy, foggy dew. Again I am a bachelor, I live with my son, we work at the weaver's trade, and every single time that I look into his eyes, he reminds me of the fair young maid. He reminds me of the winter time, part of the summer too, and of the many, many times that I held her in my arms just to keep her from the foggy, foggy dew.
New chapter here, and a short one at that. Birth of Gaines. Chapter 28. Birth of Gaines. March 10th, 1951. Harold Gaines looked at his newborn son and knew he should feel happy. He knew he should be grateful that both his wife and the baby were healthy, and there had been no complications. All he could see, though, as he stared at the tiny wailing infant, was a mounting stack of bills. This was Harold and Linda's third child, and they had been pinched even before the eldest, Harold Jr., had been conceived. Harold's latest job as a shoe salesman was not working out as well as he had hoped. Granted, St. Louis was known for its shoe industry, but that fact did not do entry-level salesmen like Harold much good. Linda Gaines looked at the child lying on her chest, and her eyes brimmed over. "He's beautiful, Harold. Look, he has your jaw." Her husband smiled a smile he did not feel, and hoped his wife didn't see that it was forced. He needn't have worried. Linda Gaines was exhausted from the ordeal of childbirth, and the part of her that remained alert was entirely focused on the tiny child she was holding. They had agreed that if the baby was a boy, they would name him Richard, after Linda's late father. "Richard, Richard, do you see your daddy?" Linda said softly. The baby continued to wail, blissfully unaware, blissfully ignorant of worldly concerns. New chapter here. Chapter 29. A Meeting in New York. October 14th, 1951. 436 Trinity Street in University City, Erwin Mann said in clear, though accented English. The cab driver nodded once at his lean, somber passenger and pulled away from the airport taxi stand. Erwin collapsed into the back seat of the taxi. His quest was coming to an end, and now he wondered for the 100th time if he was making a mistake. It had taken Erwin Mann a long time to decide to come to America. For 4 dismal years after the war had ended, he had searched for some clue as to what had become of his wife Magda. Not only was Erwin unable to find anyone who knew a single thing about what had happened to her, he could not find out anything about any of the rest of the Szupak family, or any of his own blood relatives. It was as if none of them had ever existed. Finally, he had decided to come to America to find the only other known living member of his or his wife's family, her older sister, Zofia. Erwin's attempts to locate Zofia and her husband Max Collins in New York had been fruitless while Erwin was still in Europe. 3 weeks ago, he had finally decided to make the journey to the United States. New York City had been an education for Erwin Mann. He had never seen a place with such vitality. The buildings had been bigger than he ever would have dreamed. Everywhere he looked, there were people with a purpose, working, traveling, getting something done. The level of energy was greater than he had ever seen. The hotels were clean, and it seemed that anything a person could ever possibly imagine wanting was available at any number of stores for the right price. It was so different from the shortages and restrictions that had been a part of his life for as long as he could remember. Most impressive to Erwin was the seemingly universal attitude Americans held that anything was possible. He had often found himself wishing, in his first days in America, that there had been more people like this with him in Warsaw 8 years before. It had taken 2 days of blundering about, running into dead ends and feeling ineffectual, before Erwin Mann explained his entire story to a young man in the city records division who was about to go on lunch break. The man had immediately decided it was a matter of pride to track down Erwin's sister-in-law's husband. It had taken the young city clerk less than 2 hours to find the firm for which Max Collins had worked before joining the army. After that, it had taken another day before Erwin had found a former co-worker in New York who knew that when Max had joined the army, his wife and children had moved to St. Louis to live with Max's family while her husband was overseas fighting. His phone call to the Collins house in St. Louis County had brought about immediate insistence that he come there immediately. And so, Erwin had taken a flight from New York to Lambert Field in St. Louis, and now he sat in the back of the cab wondering if this had been a good idea after all. They may insist that I stay with them, but the husband may not truly wish it. I hope this does not end up a disaster, for both our sakes. The cab pulled into the driveway of a small 2-story house in the middle-class neighborhood of University City, a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. Almost all the streets there were named after colleges, which explained the area's name. Erwin paid the driver and lifted his suitcase out of the back of the taxi. Before Erwin Mann had even started up the steps to the brick residence, the front door opened and Max and Sophia Collins stood in the doorway. Erwin's first impression of his sister-in-law as he climbed the steps was that she was excited and embarrassed at the same time. Sophia was a trim woman in her mid-40s, with light brown hair just starting to show traces of gray. She wore a pale blue cotton dress that showed the effects of many washings, and Erwin could see a resemblance to his dead wife. Her husband stood with his arm around her shoulders, grinning broadly. As Erwin climbed the steps, he could not help but smile. Before he was close enough to shake Max's hand, he felt the man's overwhelming presence. His sister-in-law's husband was a big man, almost 2 meters tall, and he radiated good cheer and genuine welcome. He liked the man instantly, and just as quickly realized that the effect would be even more pronounced on women. Max reached out to take Erwin's hand in both of his. "Cześć," he said, greeting Erwin in perfect Polish. Or perhaps I should say, "Guten Tag." Sophia beamed. "My English improves since the few days in this country. I am very glad to meet you also. I am ashamed it has taken so long." "Not at all. I'm the one who snatched Sophia away from her family and took her to the other side of the world. Here, give me that suitcase." He ushered his guest into the house, and his wife followed Erwin closely. Having him come was the most exciting thing that had happened in her life for a very long time. The woman fussed over him and took his coat, and Erwin felt awkward for a moment. She's not at all like Magda was, he thought. I'm the one who should be nervous. Suddenly she started talking to him in rapid Polish. "When you telephoned, it was like a thunderbolt out of the sky. We had no idea that my sister's husband might still be alive. The rest of the family, as you know—" She trailed off and then brushed her hands together as if to wipe away the memory. "Never mind that. Come, come. You must be tired and thirsty. I have iced tea, hot coffee, juice, soft drinks, beer, liquor. What'll you have?" "Iced tea, please," Erwin replied in English. Max caught his look and realized what was worrying his guest. "Please feel free to use Polish," Max said in his wife's native tongue. "Sophia has been jumping up and down waiting for you to get here. She's been dying to have someone else to talk to." Erwin smiled and nodded. The two men sat down in the living room while Sophia was in the kitchen to get refreshments. "Your call was a very pleasant surprise," Max said easily. "Sophia has talked of little else since you phoned. We both thought that all her family and relatives had been lost. I spent several years searching in Poland and Germany after the war. I'm afraid her blood relatives were all killed, as were my own. It took a long time before I was able to believe, no, that is not the right word, except that." Sophia Collins returned with a tray. On it were 2 tall glasses of tea and a short glass with bourbon on ice. She served their guest first, then her husband, and finally sat down next to Erwin on the couch. Her face was alive, and her eyes brimmed over with tears. Abruptly, she took Erwin's glass from him, put it down with her own on the coffee table, and threw her arms around her dead sister's husband. "You cannot know what this means to me," she said as she hugged her brother-in-law. What came next was an impassioned outpouring in Polish of love and despair about the fate of her sister and guilt that she had been safe and happy in the United States of America with 2 wonderful children, while Magda was left to the barbaric Nazis. Erwin was stunned. He had feared that Zofia would blame him for her family's fate. If Magda had not married a Jew, she and the rest of the Zuzupaks might still be alive. He stammered a reply, but it came out as gibberish. "Did you think it was your fault what they did?" Max was speaking softly. Erwin nodded, almost imperceptibly. "No, son," Max said heavily, and Erwin Mann was struck with how right the term felt in the present setting, even though he was only 7 years younger than the American. "You weren't the reason," Max continued. "You were the excuse. If they hadn't used you for the excuse, they would have come up with another one. Those kinds always have an excuse for what they do. Make no mistake about it." Zofia excused herself to go to the washroom and compose herself. The guest felt relieved but awkward, and knew that his host could see his discomfort. Max Collins sat back in his armchair with the glass of whiskey held loosely in his large hands. "There's no need to talk about it right now. Not unless you want to. There's all kinds of time for that." Erwin nodded and looked absent-mindedly around the room. The house, while modest by American standards, was finer than any Erwin had ever lived in himself. The floors were oak and covered with handsome rugs. On the walls were a number of oil paintings. Some were portraits and others were landscapes, but there was a similarity to the brushstrokes, and they appeared to have been created with the same hand. As Erwin looked across the living room, he saw an open doorway to what he realized had to be Max Collins's study. The wall that he could see was dark wood, and the chair visible was heavy leather. Above the chair was a painting of a man in a bell tower. He had a look of concentration on his face, was smoking a cigarette, and cradled a rifle that carried a telescopic sight. Erwin rose from his chair and walked to the door of the study. Max was saying something to him, but he didn't hear it. A heavy mahogany desk filled the corner of the room. Next to it was a gun cabinet with a glass door which held 8 or 10 rifles and shotguns. The walls of the study were covered with more paintings, all of them depicting scenes of graphic violence, and Erwin was at once repulsed and fascinated. There was a scene of a lynching in the Old West, and another of a shapely young woman in tight 30s garb tied to a chair and about to be tortured while a man dressed in black hid behind a bookcase, evidently prepared to rescue her. When Erwin noticed the signature in the corner of this second work, he realized with a start that all of them had been painted by his host. Then he chastised himself for forgetting the reason Max and Zofia had been in New York. Max had been a cover artist for Street and Smith, the publishing house Erwin had tracked down in New York City. They published pulp fiction and other short stories, mostly aimed at a male audience. He continued to look around the study. Erwin Mann's eyes fell on a painting of a scene that commanded his attention. It showed a dirty, thuggish-looking man with an ugly grin on his face who was pressing a large revolver into the back of a uniformed policeman. The policeman was slender, with a slight pot-belly that looked inappropriate. He was off balance, his knees were buckling, and there was a slackness to the officer's features. He looked as if he had been overwhelmed by having this criminal gain the advantage on him. The detail in the painting was exceptional. Then Erwin looked at the gun in the criminal's hand. The hammer of the revolver was in the forward position, but the thug's finger was holding the trigger to the rear. Looking closely, he could see that there was a dull orange glow around the back of the barrel. Erwin felt the hair on his back stand on end as he realized the painting depicted the gun being fired and the policeman dying. "That's one of my favorite ones that got rejected." Max Collins stood next to his guest and slightly behind him, holding his drink in his hand and gazing at the canvas. Erwin had not heard him come into the room and was startled. The lead story that month was about a crooked cop who got greedy with the racketeering boys he was shaking down. Max saw his guest's puzzled reaction to the slang and explained. The policeman in the story was demanding money from the criminals. He was sharing in their illegal business. He wanted more and more of their money, until finally he asked for too much, and they killed him. "Your publishers did not like the quality of your work?" Erwin asked in amazement. Max Collins laughed softly, but with genuine amusement. "Nah, quite the opposite, I believe. Selling a magazine with a story about a cop getting killed is apparently acceptable, but putting a picture of it happening on the cover is not. They wanted me to redo it to make it look like the cop might kill the other guy. That was never in the story. The whole point of the cover was to show the cop getting killed. The bulging stomach on the policeman. Erwin Mann had an idea what Max was about to say, and he felt slightly queasy. Yeah, they bitched about that, too. Thought my eye for perspective was off. He snorted. I told old man Curtis that when you put the muzzle of a gun against somebody and pull the trigger, all those expanding gases go into the body right behind the bullet. I said I had wanted to show the guy's guts all being blown out in front of his body by that big .45 slug, but that might be a little too vivid for the editors. So instead I captured the instant before the bullet exited his body. Curtis just about had a stroke when I told him that. Erwin Mann felt lightheaded. Could not the bullet have remained inside the man's body? He said finally. This is quite an amazing conversation, he found himself thinking. Yeah, sure, if he'd been shot with a .32 or a .38 caliber, but not with a .45. I wasn't about to paint a cover that didn't jive with the story inside, and the author had the crook using a 1917 Smith & Wesson from the First World War. Anyway, even without the bulged abdomen, they weren't going to run a cover of a cop getting blasted like that. I said screw it and painted a new one of a gangster babe with big tits looking like she wanted to fuck. That's always a sure thing. Erwin gave a wan smile, and chose his English words carefully. I believe your second effort would please many readers, but this painting here, he said, indicating the one on the wall, has much meaning for me. He took a deep breath. You see, I was in the Warsaw Ghetto in the spring of 1943. You were part of the Uprising? Max Collins's eyebrows went up as he stared at his guest, who nodded in reply. I think you need a drink, the host said. He handed Erwin his glass and motioned to the leather armchair. Erwin Mann took a long swallow of the bourbon as he sat down. He had never spoken of his experiences during the war with anyone who had not been imprisoned with him. He now began to tell the American, whom he had known less than an hour, exactly what had happened in Warsaw during the months of April and May of 1943. Zofia Collins returned from the washroom and found the men in the study. She started to speak, but Max held up his hand. No arguing, Soph. Erwin is staying here with us. He's leaving when he gets sick of us both, and not before. Zofia Collins threw her arms around her husband's neck. She had not been as happy since the day of her wedding. Chapter 30. The Bowman Lad. January 10th, 1953. So, do you want to see your son, or are you going to sit in here all night? Walter Bowman leapt out of the chair in the waiting room and stood facing the doctor. A son? I have a son? Is he healthy? Is my wife all right? How is she? Is she conscious? The doctor chuckled at the string of questions the anxious man fired at him like a burst of machine gun fire. Your wife's in fine shape and awake, if tired. Your son is healthy and strong, and weighs 8 pounds, 2 ounces. I think both of them would like to see you. Come on in. The obstetrician turned and went back through the doorway, followed by a very excited Walter Bowman. Catherine Bowman held the baby on her chest. His little legs were bent and his hands made grasping motions. He had a surprising amount of hair. Henry, here's your dad, Catherine said with a tired smile. Walter gently picked up his son and held him at eye level. Henry opened his eyes and seemed to look at his father. Yeah, he's wonderful. He's absolutely wonderful, Walter Bowman said without thinking. We did good, didn't we, sweetheart? Catherine hummed her agreement. Mm-hmm. Look at how he's looking at us, honey. I bet he inherited your vision. The last time he'd been to an eye doctor, Walter Bowman's eyes had checked out at 2013. Little Henry closed his eyes and brought his hands together. He opened his eyes again and reached out towards his father. My, that's unusual, said the doctor, narrowing his eyes. We seldom see motor skills so soon after birth. He shrugged. Probably just a coincidence. After staring at the baby for a moment, he turned to the parents and nodded. I'll leave you two alone now. He left the room. Walter Bowman beamed and looked over at his wife, shaking his head at the doctor's comment. Coincidence, my foot. Great coordination from the word go. He looked back at the newborn. Well done. Are you going to be ready for a checkout in the Stearman soon? Are you going to show up your old man and make his maneuvers look sloppy, eh? Are you going to complain that you need more power? He stroked the baby's wispy hair and laid him back down on top of his wife. My goodness, oh my gosh, honey. The baby's less than an hour old and already you've decided he's got exceptional coordination. Catherine laughed. The thing is, I bet you're right. She cradled little Henry in her arms and smiled. Walter sat down in a chair and looked at his wife and son. He didn't say anything for quite a while. It felt good just to watch over the two of them. Whether it was a coincidence or not, in the coming decades Henry Bowman would prove that he did indeed have exceptional coordination, and as he grew up it would be obvious that his vision was even better than his father's. Henry would also become an accomplished pilot whose aerobatic flying abilities would be a source of great pride for Walter Bowman. The younger Bowman would never be quite as skilled in the air as his father, though this would upset neither of them. For although Henry had inherited his father's great passion for excellence, he would come to channel it into another great area. It was an area which, like aerobatic flying, demanded superior coordination and eyesight. Walter Bowman's passion for flying had helped save the lives of many good Navymen and contributed to the death of a number of enemy pilots during the war. His son's passion would ultimately bring about similar results. Henry's effect, however, would be on the entire United States of America. Well then, talk about foreshadowing. Next chapter here. Chapter 31. Trap King. July 19th, 1955. 11 for the gentleman, said the croupier as he stacked a large number of chips and slid them across the table. Max handed him one of them and collected the rest. I'm out. When you triple your stake, it's time to go and leave some of the luck for the next fellow. The croupier smiled. Max Collins had surprised him a week ago by offering to pay $100 an hour for advice at the tables. Max had told him at the end of the afternoon that it was the best money he had ever spent. Leave after you've tripled your money was one of the rules the pro had impressed upon his eccentric client. Max gave a brief salute to the man and headed towards the cashier. The man behind the barred window looked mildly bored as he counted out 71 $100 bills. Max put the money in his pocket and smiled. His bag was packed, his trap guns were stowed in the trunk of his car, and he had already checked out. It was time to head home. Max walked out into the parking lot and breathed the cool night air blowing in off the desert. He slid in behind the wheel of his new Chrysler 300 coupe and twisted the key in the starter. The big high-compression V8 with its hemispherical combustion chambers, long-duration cam, and high-flow ports rumbled to life. He dropped the lever into drive and accelerated smoothly out onto the strip. Second place at the trap shoot wasn't bad, he reflected, and more than doubling the purse at the tables made it even better. He rolled down his window to let the wind blast blow through the car. Fuck, I love this state. Big money trap shoots, high-stakes craps, more pussy than you'll ever have time to look at, and no open road speed limits day or night. Best goddamn use for a fucking desert I've ever seen. He flicked on his high beams, and the pair of aircraft landing lights he'd had installed the day after he bought the car sprung to life. The needle on the speedometer was passing through 110 miles per hour, and the engine was getting into the RPM range where it was happiest as he cruised east on Highway 50. Max Collins liked driving late at night. It's too late to give Tafia a call. I'll get a room when I hit Wendover at the other side of the state and call her in the morning, he decided. Make sure everything's all right at home. The lights of the town of Wendover came into view less than 3 hours later. New chapter here. Chapter 32. Craftsman. June 16th, 1956. Kath, honey! 78-year-old Charles Collins pleaded to his daughter Catherine Bowman. He's going to hurt himself. Henry glanced up at his grandfather. I am not, the little boy thought willfully, then went back to concentrating on what he was doing. The two adults were sitting in the backyard of Charles Collins's summer residence in Jefferson County, Missouri. Walter, Catherine, and Henry lived there with Catherine's father during the summer months. Well then, father, we just have to take that chance. They both watched carefully as 3-year-old Henry Bowman industriously tapped the hammer on the broadhead of the 6-penny nail he pinched between the small thumb and forefinger of his left hand. Henry had watched his father do woodworking projects for more than a year, and the day before, Walter had shown him how to use a hammer. A thick section of tree trunk stood on end at the edge of the driveway near the back porch, and for several years people had used it for a seat. Under Walter's supervision, Henry had hammered a handful of nails into the end grain of the log. Henry had hammered for over an hour before dinner, and had bent over only 2 nails. The next morning, before Henry woke up, Walter had thoroughly pulled the bent nails from the stump. Now, the youngest Bowman was back at it, diligently hammering away. He had not yet hit his fingers. The old man shook his head. "I still don't think he should be doing that. He's too little." Henry didn't hear his grandfather say this, for his concentration on his last swing was total. The nail head lay flush with the wood, and the little boy stooped to rest. "Father, really, I don't think we're going to be able to keep him from hammering nails now that he knows he can do it." Henry heard this comment clearly, and he smiled gaily at his mother. Her father said, trying to be irritated but failing in the face of his happy grandson. He looked up as he heard the sound of his son-in-law's Oldsmobile pull into the drive. Henry put down his hammer and ran to greet his father. "Daddy, look at how many I did!" Walter Bowman opened the driver's door and stepped out. He was carrying a paper sack in his right hand. With his free arm, Walter picked up Henry and carried him over to the log. "Well," he said with feigned surprise, "every single one is hammered perfectly. Well done." Henry beamed at the compliment. "But there's something wrong. You're using a damaged tool that's been misused and neglected." Henry had been using a rusty hammer he'd found while he was playing in the pole barn. A good craftsman should always use good tools and take good care of them. He handed his son the paper sack. Henry looked inside. "Is this mine?" he squealed. "This is the best present I ever got," he thought gaily. "It's your very own. It's an east wing, just like your old man's." Walter grinned as his son held up the hammer. Unlike most hammers, which were wooden-handled, the east wing was forged from a single piece of steel, with a grip made of leather rings shrunk around the steel shaft and polished. Walter had found one that was used for cabinet work and was several ounces lighter than the standard model. "Here, I picked up some different sizes of nails, too." He handed Henry several small packets. "Make sure to throw the papers in the trash can." Henry quickly went back over to the log with his new prize. Catherine was shaking her head and grinning. His own cabinet-maker's hammer at 3 years old. Well, I'll be. Good tools last more than a lifetime and instill pride. And pride makes you do better work and get more satisfaction out of it. "He seems to be getting plenty of satisfaction out of hammering nails into that old log," said Charles Collins dryly. In 4 summers, the section of the oak tree would have its entire top surface covered with overlapping nail heads, so that none of the end grain remained visible. There would be over 4,000 nails embedded, every one except the first driven home by Henry's Estwing cabinet-maker's hammer. Henry's nail log, as it became known, would elicit an interested comment from every person who saw it for the first time. He never did hit his finger, not a once, despite his grandfather's fears. Standing on the bank of the Roaring Fork River with his fly rod made of split bamboo, Ray Johnson reflected on his junior year of high school, which had ended the day before. Once again, he had maintained his 4.0 GPA average, even though he had been taking senior-level math and science courses as a junior. The rest of his classmates were going to be together in Pitkin County for another year, but he would not be with them. Eastern schools were always on the lookout for talented applicants from parts of the country that were not normally drawn to New England. Ivy League universities felt that diversity of the student body was very important, provided that each member of the incoming class had the ability to do the work. The admissions officer at Brown University, after reviewing Ray's academic and athletic record, had been extremely impressed. He had not seen this kind of applicant from a rural area in a state like Colorado before. He had offered to take Raymond a year early, if he would make a firm commitment to Brown. "I wish Mom didn't seem so sad about it," he thought. "Dad was as excited as I was. Maybe I can get a moose permit in Maine during the winter. I'd like to get a chance to hunt in a different part of the country." What Raymond had learned of the Brown campus and its academics had excited him, but school was out now. He was standing on a riverbank in Colorado, and outdoor pursuits occupied his mind much more than calculus and chemistry. Raymond felt the faintest of twitches, and then the hand-laminated fly rod bent into the shape of an inverted J as he flicked it, setting the hook in the trout's mouth. He played out the 4-weight line, giving the fish room to run so as not to snap the lightweight tackle. Musings about college receded from his mind and gave way to the task at hand. Not as good as hunting, he thought with a grin as he played the fish. but it'll do. For now. New chapter here. Chapter 33. Icarus Rising. June 5th, 1959. 6-year-old Henry Bowman was terribly excited, and just a little scared. The feeling, he decided, was a good one. He turned as far around as he could in the front cockpit so he could look at his father. A homemade seat raised Henry up high enough to look through the short windscreen in front of him. The little boy wore a pair of goggles that dwarfed his head and gave him a bug-like appearance. He had a huge smile on his face. "After the engine's running, you won't be able to hear me. Remember, don't touch the stick at all until I give you the sign." Walter made an exaggerated thumbs-up gesture. "Hold on to the sides of the cockpit like I showed you, so I can see where your hands are. If you start to feel bad or you want me to come back to the airport here and land, just turn around and point to the ground like this." He made a pumping motion of his right arm towards the ground with his index finger extended. "It will be a little hard to see out the front when we're still on the ground, but once we're in the air it should be easy. All set?" Henry nodded enthusiastically to his father. Walter Bowman clicked his harness into place and lit up the big Pratt & Whitney's radial. As the noise and the prop blast enveloped him, Henry realized he had never been so excited in his life. His father taxied the plane out to the runway, but he did not lift the tail wheel off the ground. The throttle response on the overpowered plane had always been instantaneous, and the prop was longer than a standard one. He had never been willing to risk putting a tip into the asphalt and damaging the crank with a technique that worked well on a standard engine. After the run-up and all pre-takeoff checks, Walter Bowman pulled out onto the runway, straddled the center line, shoved the stick forward, and gave the big radial 2/3 throttle. The Stearman leapt forward, and the right wingtip raised slightly from the torque of the engine. Walter countered with right rudder and aileron, and in a few seconds fed in full throttle, holding the biplane straight and level a few feet off the runway, building speed. At the mid-field mark they were indicating 140 knots. At the far end of the runway, Walter pulled the stick back in his lap and released back pressure when the airplane was flying straight up. "Oh boy," Henry thought. "This is like what those rocket plane pilots do." He gripped the sides of the fuselage as hard as he could. When the airspeed indicator had wound down to 70 knots indicated, Walter kicked in full left rudder and rolled the wings level, flying at a right angle to the runway at an altitude of 1,000 feet above the ground. "Wow," Henry thought, as he saw where the ground was. His head swiveled left and right like a spectator at a tennis match. Walter laughed into the wind blast. Henry was having even more fun than he was. They headed out across the Mississippi River and over Illinois, climbing at 3,000 feet per minute. At 5,500 feet, Walter leveled the wings and held a steady 140 knots airspeed. At that altitude, the temperature was 18 degrees cooler than on the ground, which made it a very pleasant 68 degrees Fahrenheit. When they were over the open soybean fields in Illinois where he could easily land if there was an engine failure, Walter began the standard maneuvers he had previously explained to his son. First he rolled the plane left into a 30-degree bank and made a complete circle, ending up on the same heading. "It hardly feels like we're moving now," Henry marveled. "It's just really loud and windy." The stick between his legs tipped to the right as Walter reversed the controls and began a circle in the opposite direction. "It's just like Dad said," Henry thought, as the stick returned to the vertical position and the plane stopped rolling but stayed in the bank. Henry was thinking about this when Walter lowered the nose, put the biplane into a modest dive, and increased the throttle setting. At 160 knots airspeed, he pulled back on the stick and held it there. "Ooh," Henry thought, as his insides were dragged downwards from the G-forces. They were well past vertical before the pressure subsided. "I'm floating," Henry thought as Walter eased off on the back pressure. "Floating upside down." The Stearman flew itself over the top of the loop and into an inverted descent. When they were aimed straight at the ground, Walter once again pulled back on the stick, jamming Henry into his seat once more, and finishing the maneuver with the plane straight and level. Henry twisted around in his seat and gave his father a huge grin. Walter gave his son the thumbs-up sign, and Henry took his hands off the sides of the cockpit. He pushed the stick to the left, and the airplane rolled into a bank, somewhat shallower than the one his father had used. The nose dropped slightly as the plane continued on its circular path. Henry saw the river appear again after the plane had traveled 180 degrees. A dark green field appeared in the distance that Henry remembered had been in front of him before he started the turn. When he saw it, he rolled the wings back to level. His father looked at the compass. Henry was off of his original heading by only 10 degrees. The boy hesitated for a few moments, then rolled the airplane into a right turn, just as his father had done. This time he pulled back on the stick a little bit to keep the nose up in the turn. Once again, he rolled the wings level when the green field appeared in front of him. Henry twisted in his seat and saw his father smiling and nodding to him. He needed no further urging. The young boy pushed the stick forward and put the biplane in a slight dive as his father had done. Then he hauled back on the stick with all his strength. Walter Bowman saw that Henry was not strong enough to exert the required amount of pressure, so he hooked his index finger around his own control and gave a little assistance. He also judiciously used the rudder pedals to keep the aircraft stable on its yawing axis. Henry Bowman was so excited and amazed he felt as if he would burst. "I'm making this airplane fly, straight up! It's doing whatever I make it do!" As the Stearman passed through vertical, he remembered to relax back pressure as his father had instructed him, and he let the plane continue climbing inverted until gravity and the airfoil of the wings pulled it over into an inverted dive. When he saw they were aimed at the ground, with the wind noise increasing in his ears, for the first time that day, 6-year-old Henry Bowman was genuinely scared. "Dad can save us if I don't do it right," he reminded himself. And with that as his mantra, the little boy concentrated on completing the maneuver successfully. He pulled back on the stick as hard as he could to finish off the loop, and he felt a knot in his stomach as the noise continued to increase. Walter was helping with the effort required to hold the stick back, and in 10 seconds the biplane was once again flying straight and level. The boy let go of the stick and gripped the sides of the cockpit where his father could see his hands. His heart was pounding, and blood roared in his ears. He had never had a feeling like this one before. 3 feet behind him, his father was laughing into the wind blast. The sight of his son's little head peering over the windscreen in front of him with his hands gripping the edge of the cockpit pleased the father to no end. He flew the plane straight and level for a while before continuing with any other maneuvers. He didn't want to do too much too soon on his son's first time up. After a while, Walter saw that their fuel was getting low, so he turned back towards the airport. He put the airplane in a steep dive over the river and leveled it at 300 feet of altitude and 200 knots airspeed. At that height, the speed that they were traveling was very apparent. "Boy," Henry thought, "you're really moving now. This is lots faster than a car." Walter raised the nose as they approached Missouri, and traded the airspeed for more altitude as they got over land again. He headed back to the airport at an altitude of 1,000 feet above the ground, entered the pattern, and made a flawless landing. Walter taxied to the hangar and stopped the engine, then climbed out of the rear seat and went to help his son out at the front. Henry's face was streaked with oil and dirt, and he kept licking his teeth and swallowing. "You'll have to learn to keep your mouth closed in open cockpits, kiddo. The wind blast will dry you out in a hurry. You might end up swallowing a bug or two also." "That was the most fun I've ever had. Can I go with you again next time, Dad?" "Well, of course. But right now we've got to get this airplane tied down in the hangar, and then get back home in time for lunch. Here, let me help you out of there." He grabbed his son under the arm and lifted the laughing boy out of the cockpit and onto the lower wing. When the two arrived back at the house, Henry couldn't remember anything about the drive home. He was still reveling in his first flight. Meanwhile, in a different setting, "Can't you do anything right?" Harold Gaines demanded as he looked at his son's report card. The highest grade on it was a C, in social studies. Richard Gaines hung his head but did not reply. He had not seen his father this angry over grades before, and he decided to stay quiet until the situation was clearer. Harold Gaines was not specifically upset about his son's low grades. They were, in fact, very similar to what the father's own grades had been when he had been about that age. And this report card was no worse than the others that his son had brought home that year. What made the elder Gaines so angry was the note that Richard's teacher had printed at the bottom of the official document. "I am recommending that Richard repeat the 2nd grade. It is obvious that he is not ready to progress with the rest of the class. Please contact the school at your earliest convenience to discuss this matter." Harold Gaines put the report card back in the envelope and shook his head in utter disgust. "The boss won't get off my back at work, and now you surprise me with this fucking crap? We'll talk about it later. Tell your mother I'm going out for a while. Don't expect me for lunch." He put on his hat and walked out the door of the cramped South Side apartment. He fingered the 2 crumpled dollar bills in his pocket. His friend Jerry tended bar in the mornings. Harold thought he might be good for a free one, or at least a little credit. Richard Gaines snuffled miserably as his father headed out the door. In yet another location. Raymond Emmett Johnson, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa Society, called out the administrator. The young man in black robe and mortar board stood up and walked to the stage, accepted the proffered diploma, and shook the hand of the Brown University president. He smiled and nodded at the older man, amid cheers and applause from the audience. He felt a slight fatigue that was somehow very pleasant. Not bad, he thought, with mild pleasure. Not bad at all. Ray made his way back to his seat as the administrator's sonorous voice announced Arthur Johnson, the next Brown University graduate on the list. After the commencement exercises were over, the students broke up and mingled with the friends and family members who had come to see them graduate. Bud and Louise stood under an oak tree with Bud's brother Carl a few feet to the side. All 3 were beaming. "Wasn't sure you really did it. Not until he'd handed you that sheepskin and then gone on to call the next boy's name." Louise Johnson rolled her eyes at her husband's attempt at humor and gave her son an enormous hug. "You probably want to be with your friends. Don't mind us." Louise Johnson was not at all used to New England, and she was unaccountably nervous being at a large university. Raymond was the first person in her family that had gone to college, and it showed. "I've been with them for 4 years, Mom. I'd rather spend this time with you." His Uncle Carl laid a gnarled hand on Raymond's shoulder and drew him aside. "Oh, Lord, boy. 4 years in college and you still haven't figured a damn thing out about women. Your mother's trying to tell you that she's about to burst into tears because nothing like this has ever happened in her life before. And you need to understand that and make yourself scarce for a few minutes, so she don't embarrass herself in front of her only son. Now, Raymond, things have been better than we have any right to expect out of the ranch, and I don't know what Bud and your ma have in mind for you, but this here is a present from me. Take it. Now don't you give me no lip now, 'cause I'm older than you and you ought to respect that. I also got no family of my own, and I'm just as proud of you as Bud and Louise. Don't let on I gave it to you, though, and please spend it on something you really want, like a party with a bunch of them co-eds or whatnot. That's all I'm gonna say for now. Congratulations." He thrust a tight-folded envelope into his nephew's hand and turned away. Raymond put it in his pocket and stepped over to his parents. "Give me a few minutes, please. There's a few people I'd like to talk to before they leave with their parents." He walked purposefully towards a group of graduates he knew vaguely. But all Raymond hoped to accomplish was to give his mother the time his Uncle Carl had said she needed. He engaged a young man he barely knew in congratulations and small talk for a few minutes, then moved on to another cluster of classmates and their families. When he was well away from his own family, he pulled the envelope from his pocket and opened it. It contained $1,000 in cash. For a brief instant, Raymond tried to imagine what kind of party with co-eds could possibly cost $1,000. And he grinned at his uncle's admonition. He knew exactly what he was going to spend the money on. And it wasn't women. Back with the Bowman family, "I think your father has something else for you." Catherine Bowman had been listening to her 6-year-old son talk endlessly of the morning's experience flying the Stearman. "Honey, after this morning, I don't think it will be very interesting," Walter told her. "What is it, Dad? Can I see it? What's Mom talking about?" Like virtually all 6-year-olds, Henry Bowman loved presents and surprises. "You've become such a good reader, so I got you a book that every young man should have, to know what to aim for," he added. "Here, take it." Walter handed his son a hardcover book about 1.25 inches thick. Henry took the book from his father and looked at the cover. There were several pictures printed on it. One was of 10 men all pedaling a very long bicycle. Another was of an enormous flag hanging on the side of a building. A third photo showed a huge diamond set into an ornate staff. Henry looked at the title. The large first word was unfamiliar to him, but the others were easy enough to read. "Guinness Book of World Records," the title said. Underneath was the explanation. Which is highest, lowest, biggest, smallest, fastest, slowest, oldest, newest, loudest, greatest, hottest, coldest, and strongest? As his father had known he would be, Henry was fascinated. He had never heard of such a book. "Thanks, Dad!" He gave his father as forceful a hug as he could. A little on the dry side, don't you think? A listing of unrelated facts was not Catherine Bowman's idea of the ideal book to curl up with at night in a comfortable chair. "We'll see if it bores him," her husband said with a wry laugh. Both of them knew their son well enough to know that was the last thing that was likely to happen. "Can I go to my room now?" Henry asked. His parents both nodded. He ran up the stairs clutching his new treasure. Henry Bowman spent most of the afternoon poring over the Guinness Book. The table of contents listed various categories such as the natural world, human achievements, man-made objects, and the animal kingdom, which made it easy to find interesting ideas to explore. It was also the first time Henry had ever used an index, and he was delighted at his discovery that he could dream up something and then find it immediately. He was thrilled when he saw that what his father had told him was confirmed by this book. The tallest known man in the world had lived just across the river from them in Alton, Illinois. His name was Robert Wadlow, and he had grown to a height of 8 foot 10 inches before he died. Walter had met him as the two men had shared the same doctor. Henry learned that other people had claimed to be much taller, some insisting they were over 10 feet, but would always be proven wrong when they were measured. When he read this, he got goosebumps as a revelation struck him. Teddy Block at school tells lies, but some grown-ups do too. If you don't know someone really well, you need to get the proof, no matter how old they are. As Henry continued searching, he saw that many people had made claims they could not back up, but the Guinness Book only accepted records that were proven. As he was looking through the section on sports records, his mind began to wander. The listed times for running and swimming various distances didn't mean anything to him, and he was about to go back to the section about the thinnest and heaviest people when the word shooting caught his eye. "My Uncle Max shoots clay pigeons and rifles and pistols too," he thought excitedly. "I'll look up the best shooter, and next time he comes over I'll ask if he's ever met him." Henry examined the information listed, but it was in the form of a table, and the types of competition were confusing. Free pistol? Running deer? What kind of contests were these? Further, all the record holders were from other countries. It was not nearly as compelling as the photos of weightlifters or the descriptions of men who had survived falling from airplanes without a parachute. He continued to look through the section about guns and shooting when another item grabbed his attention. Block tossing. The world record for shooting a rifle at 2-inch wooden blocks thrown into the air is 72,491, 9 misses out of 72,500 thrown, by Adolf Topperwein of the United States of America, accomplished over a 12-day period at the San Antonio, Texas Fairgrounds in 1906. Revolver. The greatest rapid-fire feat was that of Ed McGivern of the United States of America, who on August 20th, 1932, at the Lead Club Range in San Diego, twice fired 5 shots in 45 seconds at 15 feet, which could be covered by a silver $50. Henry completely forgot about the world's biggest ship or fastest aeroplane. 5 shots from a revolver in less than half a second. A man who used a rifle to shoot over 72,000 wooden blocks and only missed 9. And it took a week and a half to do it. Ordinary people did these things. Henry felt shivers run down his spine at the prospect. I wonder if my Uncle Max has heard of these men. He continued looking through the section on guns and shooting when he came upon another interesting item. Highest caliber. The largest guns made were 2-bores. Less than a dozen of these were made by 2 English wildfowl gunmakers in about 1885. Normally, the largest guns made are double-barrel 4-bore rifles weighing up to 26 pounds, which can be handled only by men of exceptional physique. Henry read the words over and over. He knew that wildfowl meant birds, and that the 2-bores described were shotguns. But a 26-pound rifle can be handled only by men of exceptional physique, they say. The words gave a powerful jolt to his imagination. Henry thought of his father lifting their new refrigerator on his back and putting it in the kitchen. Dad could shoot one of those. So could Uncle Max. Maybe Uncle Max even has one. Henry Bowman closed his eyes. He was grown up, holding the enormous double-barrel rifle to his shoulder. The corded muscles in his arms stood out under tension as he held the rifle firmly in position, both eyes open. As he pulled the trigger, a deafening roar filled the air as he was rocked backwards by the recoil. Smoke and flame belched out of the gun's muzzle, and a hole he could stick his thumb into with room to spare appeared in the dead tree before him. Chunks of dead wood exploded out the backside of the tree as the huge bullet exited. He brought the rifle back down out of recoil, leaned forward, and pulled the trigger a second time. Once again the huge rifle thundered, and the hole in the tree enlarged slightly as the second bullet went in almost right on top of the first. He lowered the rifle and smiled with satisfaction. Henry opened his eyes, stood up, and walked downstairs to ask his parents when Uncle Max was going to visit. The 6-year-old boy had no way of knowing that double-barrel rifles like the 4-bores mentioned in the Guinness Book had dual triggers, not the single trigger he had imagined. Apart from that minor error, however, Henry had accurately seen into the future. Something else had happened as well. Henry Bowman had just become a new member of the gun culture. And with that, this concludes Chapter 33, Icarus Rising, of Unintended Consequences by John Ross. Chapter 34, Lawyer and Huntsman, June 6, 1959, beginning on page 91, shall be enclosed as the starting chapter of this next section of this video series. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Auf Wiedersehen. P.S. Since it is presently Easter Sunday, April 12, 2020 at 8:15 p.m. when I am finishing this final chapter of this section of this video series, I would like to wish you all a happy Easter as well. So, with that out of the way, I wish you all a wonderful Easter. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Wherever you are, Auf Wiedersehen.